It took a few days, but the election of 2020 is called for Joe Biden and the nation's first woman vice president, Kamala Harris. But the fight appears poised to go on, with allegations of impropriety from President Trump that stretch right into Detroit's downtown convention hall. Is the end in sight for an election that drew more American voters than any in history? Today is Sunday, November 8th, 2020, and this is Flashpoint.
Hi, welcome to Flashpoint on the Sunday after Election Day. And here we are with a declared winner and an incumbent who refuses to concede, something that many predicted might occur. As word came that Joe Biden had finally crossed the electoral threshold, celebrations broke out all over America, but not at the most American address of all, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. In fact, President Trump foreshadowed this outcome any number of times when he refused to say that he would go along with the results should he lose. We're going to get to the allegations of impropriety that have dominated the White House reaction since Wednesday. When it was hard to miss, the numbers moved in a different direction when the counting in many states moved from the polling place ballots to those that were cast by mail. But let us not lose the really extraordinary story of this election day. After years and years of many complaining of low voter turnout and engagement, the electoral cup runneth over. In Michigan, 5.5 million votes cast. Both Joe Biden and Donald Trump set vote records, and Kamala Harris broke through 3 or 4 ceilings herself. But that overwhelming voter participation led to a system that needed quite a bit of time to sort itself out in many states, especially in the places where the margins were thinnest, and a few votes here and there were the difference between getting an infusion of electoral votes or leaving the state empty-handed. The move of the numbers from Trump-heavy to Biden-heavy led to a very strange, many felt dangerous reaction from the president in the wee hours of election night. And it became clear the president felt aggrieved by the mail-in votes he had long claimed were faulty, if not downright fraudulent. And very quickly, Michigan, in fact, we saw stories circulating on social media of everything from software glitches to an order to backdate late arriving ballots. Is there any merit to the accusations that are keeping the president from conceding the race? This morning, Chris Thomas, the former state elections director who was brought in to help oversee the Detroit election effort, is here to answer the criticisms, some of which are being directed right at him by the Republican National Chairwoman, Ronna McDaniel. Chris Thomas is up first today on Flashpoint. And let's start with these allegations that are keeping the president from conceding the race. A number of them center on Michigan, a number of them made by the Republican National Chairwoman, Michigan native Ronna McDaniel, who included this allegation from what she says is a whistleblower who didn't like what she saw at TCF Center in downtown Detroit during the count.
On the morning of November 4th, whistleblower was instructed by their supervisor to take the ballots with no dates, enter them into the electronic record, and place either November 2nd or November 3rd as the date received.
Now, that supervisor she's talking about is the man who spent 35 years as Michigan's elections director, who was brought in to oversee Detroit's counting effort, and Chris Thomas is my guest this morning. Chris, really good to have you on the program. I really appreciate it. Let you start with that. She made a number of allegations the other day, but that one was central to you, and she says it came from an affidavit from a poll worker who was not a volunteer, but a contract worker, who says that she was being asked to backdate ballots.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you to answer some of the questions that you have concerning the conduct of the election last Tuesday and Wednesday. Regarding that allegation, to my mind, there is no validity whatsoever. What we do in elections in Michigan is we ensure that no voter is disenfranchised due to a clerical error. I am not sure who this employee is, and I was not supervising any employees. I was not at the center in a supervisory role. What occurred with a number of ballots is that voters went to a satellite site. They voted their absentee ballot, gave it back to the clerk. And the clerk, when they entered the last step, they entered the date of receipt, which that clerk had stamped onto the envelope. And then they were required to push a button which said save. And if that button's not pushed, then that voter's name does not end up on the poll list. So when the workers out at the tables tried to scan the barcode on the label of the envelope, the name did not pop up. So it was brought to a central area. They looked in the qualified voter file, which is the Secretary of State's statewide system,
Right.
and saw that in fact that it was an incompleted process. So we had the envelope, we had it date stamped, the date was entered into the system, and the save button was pushed. So it was not backdating. These were not ballots that were received after Election Day. Most of them were received on Monday, November 2nd, the day before the election.
We had a number of other issues that day. People were very upset that when all of a sudden there was paper being placed up and cardboard being placed up on some of the windows, and they felt that there was that was all designed to hide some sort of chicanery going on at TCF.
Well, that simply is not the case. So when that occurred, there were a massive number of challengers in the room for both the parties. And I would say the Republican Party at that point had more challengers in the room than they were entitled to. I understand that the windows, one, were blocked because the workers at the tables close to the windows were highly distracted by people out there banging on the windows, waiting for glass to shatter and photographing them. So it added a real discomfort level to the workers, and it was totally unnecessary.
Well, did papering over the windows, though, make that problem worse rather than better?
Well, it gave the workers the confidence they needed to move ahead with their work. There were challengers in the room. There were challengers over at those tables. It's not like there were no challengers present.
One of the
People
other
outside the room were misbehaving, banging on windows. For all we knew, that glass could have shattered.
One of the other allegations that you've heard is that those who were inside as they left weren't being allowed to be replaced. Those who, the observers or the challengers. I spoke to a woman this past week who called. She had gone through 2 days of training, went down there, hoped to be able to get inside, never got in, and she felt that she was seeing as people left, they weren't being replaced. And to her way of thinking, it seemed to be more Republicans that was happening with rather than Democrats.
Well, people have different sets of glasses on, so they were replacing people when they left. They would let another one in. They started having them sign out. And remember, this was at a point when at least one of the parties was well over their quota of one per table. So it's not as if there were not enough challengers in there to watch the process. And in fact, any of the confusion and chaos that people want to ascribe, I would ascribe to challengers. They did not put a person at each table. They all gathered in the main thoroughfares throughout the room, rather than being out at the tables where they belonged. It was difficult to walk through. It created quite a bit of difficulty in terms running the operation.
Chris, one of the reasons that you were brought in was because there were a lot of problems in the primary in Detroit. We found that more than 70% of those ballots would not have been recountable with the way that they were handled. If there is a recount ordered in Michigan, which is still up in the air, are you convinced that the Detroit vote is recountable this time?
Well, we're in the canvass process right now. That canvass process, the purpose of that is to, in fact, make sure that these are all balanced. So that's going to be an ongoing process that we're going to work on and make sure that all balancing to the extent possible is done. So at this point, I think that we ran a very good show and that we put a good number of ballots, probably close to 170,000 ballots through the process in a 2-day period. And so we will continue on with the canvass.
Chris, you've seen a lot in your many years of working for both Republican and Democratic administrations, Republican and Democratic secretaries of state. I know this has been a most unusual one in your 35 years. I so appreciate your time. Thanks very much for being here and talking about it with us this morning.
Thank you, too.
You bet. Chris Thomas, who helped oversee the counting effort in Detroit. Where do we go from here? Let's talk about that next as we continue on Flashpoint.